Welcome to the Spectre of Communism. Once more, we've gone to social media to ask for you to give us questions about communism, Marxism, and revolution.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism.
The communists.
The communists.
The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
So, if you watched our last Viewers' Questions episode with Ben Curry, you'll know the formats. I have a leading communist with me here today, Nicholas Albin Svensson from the International Secretariat of the Revolutionary Communist International. Nicholas, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
And we are going to put some of our favourite viewers' questions from social media on the board and have Nicholas answer a few of them in a quick fire round. Nicholas, are you ready?
I am very much ready.
Okay, first question on the board now. What is value? What do you mean by value? What does it even mean, value, in the labour theory of value? Are we talking of something valuable, something to be valuable, or the value of something? And what is the difference between value and exchange value? So, to boil it down, the question is, what do we mean by value? Nicholas?
Well, I think if you start from the end, I think that makes maybe more sense. So, when we talk about something being valuable, it's it's a term that means a lot. It means a lot of different things, even in the way you use it common speak. You can value something, or you can talk about something being valuable in the sense of being monetary, that you can sell it for a lot of money. And in a similar way, Marx talks about use value and exchange value. So he distinguishes between these two different concepts. Use value is what it's used for, how you can use it, right? So a hammer, you can hammer nails with, for example. Or a table, you could put stuff on it. This is what use value is. It's like what you can use it for. And so any item they sold would, well, practically all of them, they would have to have some kind of useful purpose. But that is different to the actual value of them when they're being exchanged. So what they call exchange value, which is not determined by how useful they are. Use an example of air, for example. Like air is extremely useful to human beings.
So some would say an absolute necessity.
You might say that, but it's actually free.
For now.
So it's not a question
now.
of, it's not, yeah. As long as we could just pick up the oxygen by breathing in, air is free, right? There's no need, you don't need to pay anyone for it. There's no point in selling it. And so that's what makes, then, there's no really any exchange value to air used in normal time, even though it's very useful. So the point about why something costs money or costs a lot of money compared to cost of little money is not dependent on how useful it is. And this is something the bourgeois economists, they always fudge these two questions, saying, oh, no, people want it a lot because it's useful and therefore it's valuable. But that's not the way it is. Exchange value rather, and this is what Marx basing himself on Adam Smith and David Ricardo.
So these were bourgeois economists that were kind of the pinnacle of that class's investigation into the nature of capitalism.
Yeah, these are two very important thinkers in actually trying to understand what is the basis of the capitalist economy and how does it function and so on. I mean, they quote Adam Smith a lot today, you know, for the invisible hand and the glories of the market and so on, but actually he had much more to say than those quotes that you often hear. And what he did was basically start by developing what we call the labor theory of value. That is, something is valuable because we, as human beings, we create it with labor. We work to create something. And that's what makes it valuable. And that's what differs air from a table, right? Air is just there. You can just breathe it in and it's there. You don't have to have someone basically work to provide it to you. Unlike a table, which needs to be made from wood, using nails, using hammers, all kinds of saws, all kinds of different implements and so on. And that's what makes a table valuable in the market compared to air. And the amount, and then they also worked out, Smith and Ricardo, they worked out that actually something is more valuable the more work that's being put into it, the more hours of labor is put into it.
Well, just to demonstrate the difference here, air in normal circumstances has no exchange value because it requires no labor to obtain. But if you need to take air to the bottom of the sea or to space, suddenly it becomes quite expensive. The canisters of air that are necessary for deep sea diving and the air that's stored for use by astronauts is actually quite expensive because there's labor that goes into pressurizing it, putting it in canisters and transporting it.
Yeah, to make all the machinery that is needed to be able to pressurize it, making the canisters, and then the actual energy that goes into pressurizing, as well as all the transport is required. It completely changes the ball game, basically, because you need it in a particular way, and that's what makes it then valuable. And so Marx basically based himself on this and say, well, this is on these, which were the most advanced thinking when it come to economics at that time, and he based himself on that, and then further developed their ideas.
Before we get into what Marx added, I just want to quote directly from The Wealth of Nations, Book 1, Chapter 5, by Adam Smith, to show the line along which he was thinking. He writes, "The real price of everything and what everything really costs to the man who wants to acquire it is the toil and trouble of acquiring it. What everything is really worth to the man who has acquired it and who wants to dispose of it or exchange it for something else is the toil and trouble which it can save to himself and which it can impose upon other people. What is bought with money or with goods is purchased by labour, as much as what we acquire by the toil of our own body." Fairly straightforward, fairly clear. In his conception, the value of a thing comes from labour.
Yeah, and that's what, as I said, Marx developed this. In particular, he said, well, it's not just, I don't know exactly know if this was Ricardo or Marx who came up with this, but it says it's not just enough to say, oh, just because I worked a lot on something, it makes it, I can then sell it for however long it took me. Like if I was to go out and make a table today, which would take me a long time, probably, I don't know, a week. That doesn't mean that I can sell it for a week's work of labor.
No, being incompetent DIY doesn't make a table more valuable.
Thank you for that, Joe.
No offense.
Assessment of my qualities.
He's actually quite good at assembling IKEA furniture, I happen to know.
But anyway, but compared to a factory produced one, right? I'll be much slower, but that doesn't mean that I can just impose my price on it, because so what is needed is basically what is socially necessary. So what in society in general we need, how much labor needs to be put into something in order that is what would turn out to be the exchange value.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would just a pen, for example, is relatively little labor that is required in order to produce a pen these days. Used to be a lot more expensive, but these days there's relatively little labor. Whereas a car has lots and lots and lots of labor that goes into it, and therefore it's lots more expensive. And so this is, you can see here that this is what makes a difference between something being cheap when you go and buy it, or costs little money at least, and something costing a lot of money. It's amount basically human labor that is required, and that includes obviously all the raw materials that are needed in order to produce it, like all the aluminium and steel that are needed for a car, as well, or the engine, all the different parts, as well as the machinery that is required in terms of robots or whatever that you use to build a car. All of this has to come together in order to produce the exchange value of the car, and that then, which is, we say, it's the price that we find, and when we go to the market and we go and try and buy something, it's something which is an approximation of the exchange value.
That's actually something I wanted to deal with in a bit more detail, because is price equal to value? Because a commonplace assumption, and actually you see this written in some bourgeois economics textbooks, and you certainly hear it from apologists for capitalism, if something costs £5, if the market has decided that something is worth £5, then that's what it's worth. That's its value, right? What's the difference between value and price?
Well, the market prices tend to fluctuate a lot, and so, sometimes they fluctuate. For example, during the pandemic, you had a temporary spike in the demand for toilet paper for no particular reason. and the price increased. You up the price in order to basically because they could.
Yeah, exploited the fact that everybody wanted toilet paper
Yeah.
to artificially inflate the prices.
And so and this happens frequently. It doesn't mean that the amount of labor that is needed in order to produce toilet paper has suddenly increased, right? But then obviously after this temporary blip, then the price of toilet paper went down again to match or more approximate the real amount of labor that is contained in the roll of toilet paper. Right?
Yeah, Marx talks about the value as determined by labor as being the point around which, the fulcrum around which the sort of price fluctuates.
Yeah, there's another example. Obviously, you can also go the other way, right? A monopoly trying to beat their competitors could actually sell something cheaper than the amount of labor that is required, than the exchange value really ought to be. So they can sell it below the cost of production. Also happens in supermarkets to sell certain products to get people into the shop. But that is not, there's obviously just a fluctuation, a deviation from the real exchange value. But still, over time, if you think about the bigger picture, like if you compare a pen or a car, if you compare like a big car to a small car, you basically get the idea that there is a difference there, which is based on real material things, not just subjective or temporary blips.
Yeah, I remember there's a line, I think that Rob Sewell might have put it in the introduction to the companion guide to Marx's Capital, which I'll link in the description because it's really good. So Rob Sewell is the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party, our British organisation, and he says that a tractor will always be more valuable or always cost more than a plastic bucket, irrespective of the market fluctuations.
Yeah.
Because there's simply more labour crystallised, far more labour crystallised in a tractor than a plastic bucket.
Yes, that's right. Or a mobile phone and so on. It's also far less labour contained, and you can see it in the price differences. In general, I mean, it's not always in every single circumstance you can point this out, but in generally speaking, if you look at different products, you can more or less get a picture of how much labor is contained in them.
Could you say then that if labor is what determines the value of a thing, then the price it fetches is sort of pressured or influenced by market forces? So supply and demand, for example, is what motivates those fluctuations.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, in the short run, for sure, supply and demand plays a role. But the question of the supply, like what is the bourgeois economists tend to focus a lot on the demand side, to talk about how useful something is and so on, which is not the real question. The real question in the long term, I mean, even some bourgeois economists would recognize this, but they talk about is the supply question. Like at what point are you able to deliver, at what cost is required in order to deliver, how much labor do you need in order to deliver a certain quantity of this product, because it can also fluctuate a little bit. Like if you need to produce, sometimes things become more expensive when you need to produce more of it. Sometimes it becomes cheaper when you produce more of it. So for example, some raw materials, oil, for example, there's some finds of oil in the world which are very cheap to extract. So if you need to produce more oil every year, then it becomes more expensive to produce it. But obviously, and then sometime with manufactured products, when you have small runs of things, they're quite expensive, but when you increase the run, they become cheaper. So there are lots of different factors that affect this question. But in general speaking, over a period of time, it's like this question of how many products are brought to the market and at how much labor is necessary in order to bring those get those products to the market.
So we've illustrated that Marx didn't conjure his economic theories out of nowhere. He based himself on existing tradition. He started, you could say, with the highest accomplishments of bourgeois economics, but he didn't just take them over wholesale with no alteration, right? Marx made an original contribution, important, well, critical and ingenious original contributions to the field of economics. So what was Marx's main contribution or innovation?
Well, I mean, I think what really a lot of things flowed from it, but one of the key question that he developed from, which his predecessors had shied away from, which was to try to work out where does profit come from.
Right.
Where it's like, how do the big corporations make their profits, right? Where do they come from? If we say, as we say, the labor, it's from the worker creates the value, and that's what is contained in each product, the value of the amount of hours that they've toiled at their machines. They've created these products that are being sold. Then where does the profit come from? How can the capitalists make profit? Are they tricking the workers? And this was some of the early socialists. They all thought that it was a trick played on the workers, that the capitalists were not giving them the full, what they were paying them, what their labor was actually worth.
Yeah, and value, price, and profit, I think Marx is taking on some of these arguments, right?
Yeah, but what Marx says, well, actually, the question isn't that. The question is that labor power, is what the worker sells. So the workers, there's a market and there's a commodity, which is labor power, which is being sold on the market. So that's the worker's ability to work. So they go to the market not to sell like a product. They go to the market to sell their ability to work. Say, I work typically 40 hours a week, and I will do it at this and this wage. And that's how the worker and the capitalists, the relationship between them is based on that, the commodity of what the cost of labor power is, not on what the labor power actually produces. So this is the difference, right? The labor power, the capitalist buys the labor power, which is a commodity, like others are traded on the market, and but out of this labor power, they then can use the labor to produce commodities, whose value is not based on how much they paid for labor power, but how many hours are being put into the commodities themselves. So, and the cost of labor power is determined not by the productivity of the worker or how much profit that they can produce, but the cost of labor power is based on other factors. In particular, how much it costs to reproduce labor power itself, i.e. the cost of feeding, clothing, the worker,
Training
and his
them as
family,
well.
his or her and family, right?
And training them as well.
Educating them.
Yeah, we talk about skilled and unskilled labor. I mean, it takes longer to teach somebody to be, say, an aeronautical engineer than it does to teach somebody to work on an assembly line. So there's more labor power, if you like. There's more, there's more labor power that's purchased, and there's more labor crystallized in teaching somebody to be an aeronautical engineer, which is part of the reason that skill, that labor power as a commodity, commands a higher price.
Yeah, so it's harder to replace, basically, because you have invested more in them, a skilled worker than in an unskilled worker, and this forms part of the whole question. There's obviously there's other things like collective bargaining, trading rights, where workers fight and they negotiate up higher wages and stuff like that, which does affect the price of labor power. But nonetheless, and it's part of the class struggle where the workers fight over the surplus of what we call the surplus value, right? So the difference between what the worker is getting paid, let's say in money terms, and what the capitalist is selling the product for. And so the difference in between those two is obviously what forms the basis of the profit.
Right.
So the surplus value, the extra value that the worker is creating beyond his own, beyond reproducing himself. So that's and that's where you get the profit. And the struggle, the class struggle, when the workers fight for higher wages, better working conditions, etc., it's a question of fighting over the surplus value.
What Marx recognized as the unique quality of labor power as a commodity is that it's capable of creating new values. And it's the only commodity that can do that.
Yeah.
No other commodity, no other raw material, not words, not even AI, is capable of creating new value. But labor power is when a worker applies themselves to a machine, to raw commodities, raw materials. They create a commodity, a new commodity, which is worth more than the sum of its parts because they've added their labor to it.
That's right. And they reproduce, they create the value which can to cover the cost of the raw materials, or rather the raw materials are transferred into the value of a new product.
Mm-hmm.
The same goes for machinery. It's also transferred into the value of new product. But the only thing that can generate new value is the labor of the worker who is employed, and that's where you can get a profit. And that's also why the bourgeois economists don't want to talk about this.
Yeah.
Because obviously what this whole thing transpires is, well, the whole idea that the capitalist class plays some kind of ingenious role, that they can sort of, as John MacDonald called them once, wealth creators, that they create wealth. This is all nonsense. All that they do is basically, and this is what Marx describes in Capital in in all of the 3 volumes, but all that the capitalist class do is come with the money.
Yeah.
Because they own a lot of money, they can bring it to the production process, they can hire the workers, they can buy the raw materials, they can buy the machinery, and that is all that they're good for, really. It's the fact that they're rich, and that's the only quality that they bring to the table. And all the rest is just secondary. So what does that mean? Like, actually, it really reveals that in the modern society, they're just parasites. They don't actually play a progressive role. They don't even manage their own companies anymore. All of this is opened up by looking at where profit comes from and the fact that the workers are creating the profit. And that's why they don't want to talk about it.
And it's also why you reach this point that Smith and Ricardo do of recognizing the real source of value. And then it just sort of stops. Any kind of meaningful, useful inquiry into the source of profit in particular is sort of abandoned by bourgeois economics. They don't really talk about it today.
No, and they completely ignore those parts of particularly Adam. Well, they love Adam Smith. They don't talk so much about Ricardo, but they always talk about Adam Smith, right? But then they don't talk about the labor theory of value, which originates with Adam Smith, precisely because Marx drew it to its logical conclusion. That actually, if you follow the logic of what Adam Smith said, what Ricardo said, you wound up where Marx, with the conclusions that Marx drew, and that has revolutionary implications. And that's what they cannot. That's why they have to abandon that whole field of inquiry.
Okay, well, I think we've covered that one pretty thoroughly from a few different angles. So I will move to question 2. What does mastering the dialectic actually look like?
I think this is it's quite a complicated question because, or rather, it's relatively simple to give a general answer to it, but in practice, it's very difficult to mastering the dialectic, if you want to use that phrase. It's the dialectic of materialism. It's a method, or it's a philosophy, but it's a method of approaching analysis and our understanding of the world. I actually found a quote. Trotsky says that the dialectic is not a master key for all question. It does not replace concrete scientific analysis, but it directs this analysis along the correct road, securing it against sterile wanderings in the desert of subjectivism and scholasticism. And I think that kind of covers this. A few complicated words there, but basically the idea is this: there's a method of analysis. It doesn't mean that you can sort of say, oh yeah, it's dialectic stuff. I don't need to study something. I don't need to understand. I don't have to look at facts. I don't have to look at figures. I can just say something that sounds good. Dialectics is not like that, but it's a method, a tool that you can use in order to analyze things. In particular, understanding how things change and how they change through contradiction. And by understanding that, by having that as part of your, analytical toolbox, then that really helps you then to understand also how society functions, society and nature functions, without having to resort to very rigid categorical definitions, which is what you usually get.
Yeah, and I think that the best way to illustrate mastering the dialectic or mastering dialectical materialism is to look at the analysis and the actions of people we would say were masters of dialectical materialism. I mean, if you want to look at what mastering the dialectic looks like with relation to understanding the dynamics of capitalism, you should read Capital by Marx. But we had a couple of examples we wanted to draw on, and I think a really useful one is the theory of permanent revolution by Trotsky, or developed by Trotsky, in relation to and based on discoveries that Marx and Engels also made in the course of the revolutions of 1848 and also the experience of the Paris Commune of 1871. We have a new issue of the In Defense of Marxism magazine out at the moment, all about the permanent revolution. So pick that up. I'll put a link in the description. But basically, Trotsky, in the run-up to and course of the Russian Revolution of 1905, so this was the first proletarian revolution that was attempted in Russia. It was defeated, but nevertheless, it scored a massive blow against Tsarism. It essentially ended autocracy in Russia, and it laid the basis for the eventual victory of 1917. Trotsky predicted, against all the perspectives of the so-called Marxists leading the Second International at the time, against the Menshevik faction in Russia, essentially against everyone, that in Russia there was a backward country, there was an underdeveloped country, semi-feudal, under the heel of a vicious autocracy. Not only do those conditions make revolution not impossible, they made it inevitable. He predicted that the chain of revolution in Europe would begin with Russia because, basically, and again, you should read Results and Prospects in particular, which is Trotsky's 1906 masterpiece where he lays down this theory. But basically, he looked at the concrete situation and conditions in Russia, and he said that you have this unusual situation where you have a powerful state and very backward relations, very backward economy, mostly peasant, mostly rural, and under the pressure of foreign competition, the Tsarist state would have to step in and develop industry to a certain level, if nothing else, to make sure that it still had a powerful army and repressive apparatus, but also to be able to at least somewhat compete on the world market and protect itself from the hostile regime surrounding it. And that would mean you had quite rapidly developing a powerful working class, at least in the urban centres, a minority class still. Most of Russia were peasants, but you were going to have this young, vibrant proletariat in industrial conditions that at least had to match the standard of the rest of the world. So you had this powerful urban class develop very quickly that had an outsized role in the economy. And everybody agreed the 1905 revolution would be a democratic revolution rather than a socialist revolution. It would be a revolution against autocracy, against the Tsar, to establish the basis of, of what we would describe as democracy, eliminating the old landlord system in the countryside, and so on. There was a capitalist class in Russia, but it was small, it was weak, it was basically under the control of stronger capitalist classes abroad, and it wasn't capable of carrying out, if you like, the classical tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution. Another urban class would have to do it. And Trotsky said that was going to be the working class, and he predicted that actually in 1904, so the year before the Russian Revolution broke out, and it began in 1905 in January with a general strike, which spread to the entire country.
Yeah, I think this is where the dialectics really comes in in order to help him draw those that analysis, because traditionally you talk about Marxism and you talk about it saying like, oh, it goes through stages, right? First you have to have primitive communism, then you have slave society, then you have feudalism, then you have capitalism, then you can have the lower stage of communism or socialism, and you have the upper stage of communism. It's a nice, neat, like, I've even seen people draw it like a staircase, right? First one, then the other, and each side you have the contradictions between this class and that class, and so on. It's a very schematic way of understanding things. But it doesn't really have much to do with actually how things worked out in most of the world. Mm-hmm. This is maybe, arguably not even in Britain and France, but at least part of it fits to Britain and France, right? You had the bourgeois revolution, led by the bourgeoisie, and which overthrew feudalism and established a modern capitalist state. Mm-hmm. But in most of the world, this is not how it transpired. And what Trotsky really goes through is he actually explains what happens, because just once these bourgeois states had been established, that suddenly had all kinds of implications for all the other states that were to come. Particularly, and Lenin, in his book Imperialism, draws a very similar point. But imperialism makes a difference. The domination of the globe by imperialism makes a massive difference. As you were saying, these new capitalists in Russia, they were completely tied to German, French, British finance capital, which were funding them, basically. They were even sometimes Germans, French, or British themselves, like their nationality, their passports would have been that. And they were also emerging and creating the factories with a really, really modern working class. They were really modern factories with a really advanced, developed working class. They were not facing like the French during the French Revolution or the English Revolution. You have a working class. Sure, you have a working class, but it's small workshops, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people working in the workshop. But they have factories of tens of thousands of workers. So you have a whole completely modern proletariat which is threatening their very existence. And the moment that they start to move, which is what happens in the revolution, right? Then they're not just questioning feudalism and the Tsar, but they're questioning also capitalism and the working conditions in the factories first of all, but eventually also capitalism itself. And because that's where they are. That's where their conditions of life is actually that of modern capitalism, not of, the small workshop of the English, early English during the 17th century in England.
Yeah, and I think that it's worth just reiterating here that dialectics says what? Society, history, the world are not made up of static and unchanging formula and things that are always the same across all of time. You have constantly developing processes and contradictory processes. And that means mastering the dialectic partly means beginning with what's actually concrete, looking at what's really happening, but being able to draw from that what the conclusions really are, even if it defies your previous outlook, previous events. If a formula doesn't describe what's actually happening, then you abandon the formula. And I mean, that's what Trotsky writes in Revolt and Prospects. He says that Marxism is not an analysis of texts, it's an analysis of social processes. And as you were saying, this very mechanical, neat view of history is passing through these discrete stages. That's precisely the view that, say, the Mensheviks had, the Menshevik faction of the Russian Marxists. And that's the reason that they said that it was necessary for the workers' movement to support the bourgeois liberals, because they thought the next stage in Russia's developments would be the victory and conquest of power of the bourgeois, of the capitalist class. So they thought the workers should support their liberal wing, their democratic wing, if you like, because when they'd had their turn in power, then eventually, at some point in the future, it'd be the workers' chance to take power. But they thought that Russia wasn't there yet, so therefore the workers would have to support the liberals. Trotsky said no. Lenin said no as well, of course, but Trotsky says no. These democratic tasks, resolving the question of landlordism, resolving the land question, felling the autocracy, the weak, parasitic, dominated capitalist class in Russia cannot carry it out. They're parasitic, and also they're tied to the old system. The capitalists in Russia made money from the landlord system. They were landlords themselves in many cases. So they had no interest. They had no independent interest in carrying out those tasks. So another class would have to sweep them aside. It couldn't be the peasantry, Trotsky argued, because they, what is a peasant? He's an isolated, atomized individual in terrible backward conditions. The peasantry had no basis for independently leading the revolution. It was going to have to be an urban class, and Trotsky identified that as the Russian proletariat, and he was right. He predicted an unprecedented development, basically, and he did that using the dialectical method, which is how you can say that he mastered the dialectic.
Yeah, and the Mensheviks and also we might call the right wing of the Bolshevik party, the socialist revolutionaries and so on, a fair amount of all these would consider themselves Marxism, and they will have this schematic view of what the revolution should be like. And as a consequence, they all wanted to support the provisional government, which was claiming to want to produce, this is after February 1917, right? And they're claiming they want to do interest land reforms. Basically, they were claiming to want to produce the bourgeois tasks. But it was very obvious as the months went past that they were never going to do this, right? Because they came up, and that rather than the bourgeois being like the ones who were leading this revolution, pushing it forward and so on, they were actually very, very, almost for the start, they were going and basically trying to kill the revolution and restore the old order. And had it not been for the Bolsheviks, the Kornilov coup, which happened in August 1917.
Which, if you watch our episode from the beginning of the season, the full timeline of the Russian Revolution, you can hear all about the Kornilov coup.
That's right. And so Kornilov, this military general, he launched a coup, and it hadn't been for the Bolsheviks and their perspective on where the revolution was going, he would have been succeeded. And you would have, well, sometimes we say, instead of having an Italian word for fascism, you would have the Russian word for fascism, because it would have started. This kind of regime would have developed first in Russia, but because the Bolsheviks that were there, they were present, and they and Lenin as well as Trotsky. This is why they came together in 1917. They understood where the revolution was going. The only way you can carry out the bourgeois tasks of the revolution was with the working class at its head, and the working class leading the revolution, which then also meant that you had to proceed from not just the bourgeois tasks, but also moving on to the socialist tasks.
Yes, which is where the permanent part of the permanent revolution comes in, because Trotsky says that having led the revolution for bourgeois democratic demands, basically, the working class won't just stop and hand power to the capitalists in order to exploit them. They'll move directly towards conquering their own demands. So the revolution develops in a permanent chain from the bourgeois democratic tasks to the socialist tasks. And again, you see that borne out in 1917, because the Tsar was overthrown in February, but it didn't stop there. The workers established the Soviets, which of course were instrumental in overthrowing the Tsar. They led the revolution that overthrew the Tsar, and they became a seat of power. The Bolsheviks eventually won the Soviets to their position, and they overthrew the bourgeois provisional government, which wanted to keep Russia in the war, that wanted to preserve capitalism, and they established a worker state and began to plan the economy under democratic workers' control, and carried out a series of other sweeping reforms. They ended landlordism. They moved to the beginning of the socialist reconstruction of society in a permanent chain of development. And of course, the other side of the permanent revolution is internationalism, the idea that you can't build socialism within the boundaries of a single country. It has to spread on the international stage.
Yeah, and what really both Trotsky and Lenin thought about this is it wasn't that they denied the backwardness of Russia, but they recognized that on an international scale, capitalism had developed. This is the whole point of Lenin's book about imperialism. Well, one of the points of the book anyway, is that capitalism on an international scale had matured and was ready to be overthrown. It hadn't matured to that level in Russia, so they didn't abandon Marxist ideas about how socialism had to be built on a high developed economy, but they recognized that the high developed economy existed on an international scale, even if it didn't exist on a national scale in Russia. And so the point about, spreading the revolution, which there's a lot of nonsense being said about what Trotsky thought about that, but the whole general point which both Lenin, Trotsky and the Bolshevik Party as well agreed on was the need to spread the revolution, because precisely to integrate Russia into a bigger, more advanced economy.
Yes. And recognizing all of these things, and not only recognizing them, but using them to inform your tactics, to inform your slogans and your demands. That's mastering the dialectic. That's taking the theory, taking the method, applying it to the concrete situation, and turning that into a guide to action.
Yeah.
I would say, if anything encapsulates mastering the dialectic, it's the application of dialectical materialism in the ideas and methods of Trotsky, Lenin, and the Bolsheviks.
That's right.
Do we want to talk about the negative examples of where the dialectic is very much not mastered or butchered and mangled in order to befit?
Well, we already mentioned Mensheviks, right? And it's one of the greatest services that was done to Marxist theory and Lenin in particular after the Russian Revolution, when they turned precisely the ideas of Lenin into this kind of scholasticism, as Trotsky calls it, like formalism. The idea of the stage theory, for example, was revived then by the followers of Stalin, right? The Stalinists. They revived this Menshevik idea of the stages, for example, and started applying it and causing all kinds of problems. But also on the question of imperialism, and this is Lenin's imperialism really gives us such a it really explains, and he's using this dialectical method, but not in a way to try to just quoting a few passages here and there, but actually goes into, in this book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, goes through and goes through how imperialism is developed. He talks about how monopoly has developed out of free competition, right? It's something the bourgeois would deny, but it's actually, there's a very good reason for it. It's a contradiction, right? You have free competition, which becomes monopoly because of the free competition. The laws of free competition inevitably lead to monopoly. He explains these things. He explains how monopoly leads to finance capital, how finance capital leads to imperialism. And he describes these things with facts and figures and arguments, and he draws the conclusions. In this debate he's having essentially with the German Social Democrat Karl to basically explain how war and imperialism are an intrinsic part of capitalism and how it has developed. And it is part of a particular stage of capitalism, a capitalism which is mature and ready to be overthrown, and how imperialism actually is very much a sign that capitalism is ready to be overthrown. But this was then developed, and you can see how people then subsequently threw around this term imperialism in all kinds of contexts where it wasn't appropriate. Trotsky, for example, had to defend the Soviet Union against a lot of people in the late 1930s, when beginning of the Second World War, when Soviet Union invaded Finland and Poland, the liberals and the bourgeois public opinion in a lot of West, there was a lot of, there was a big propaganda campaign against the Soviet Union, and they described the Soviet Union as imperialist. Mm-hmm. Why the bourgeois were described as imperialist is kind of obvious, because they're trying to blacken the name of the Soviet Union. But also this reflected itself inside the Trotskyist movement. Yes. Where Trotsky had to then defend and say, no, we have to be concrete here. Invading another country is not what is imperialism. Mm-hmm. And so this kind of formalistic or very superficial approach to what is imperialism basically landed them in effectively joining the chorus of the imperialists who were clamoring that in order to try to whip up a mood against the Soviet Union at this time in the late 1930s.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I think that really illustrates the difference between a dialectical view of a situation and a superficial, what you might call liberal or empirical view of a situation. You starting with just what's on the surface rather than getting beneath the surface to the deeper processes underneath.
And Trotsky, really one of his best works on dialectics is this, it's a short little, I can't remember, I think it might be an article that he wrote, or maybe an open letter, I can't remember, but it's called ABC of Dialectical Materialism. Mm-hmm. And he was precisely in this debate because he correctly identified that in order to understand the character of the Soviet Union, you need to understand dialectics. Mm-hmm. And this was actually tacitly recognized by his opponents, who also wanted to abandon dialectics. That came at the same time, and it made a lot of sense, because to understand the contradictory nature of what the Soviet Union was in the late 1930s, you needed to have dialectics. If you just based yourself on formalism, on formal categories like socialism, capitalism, well, Soviet Union was neither socialist nor capitalist, so where does that then land you?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's also worth saying that it's not as though dialectics only applies to politics. There are other things, well, all things. Dialectical materialism is a holistic philosophy. Marxism is a holistic philosophy. It has something to say about anything you could imagine. And it's not just politics that operates in a dialectical way. It's the world, it's the universe in general. And if you don't have the correct philosophical framework when you approach a question in, say, science, you can end up with completely incorrect hypotheses and head off in utterly the wrong direction. And I just wanted to highlight a video which is going viral at the moment about the crisis in cosmology. It's called "Astronomy is in Crisis and it's incredibly exciting." That's the name of the video. It is quite an exciting video. It's made by a channel called Kurzgesagt. I can't pronounce that. Kurzgesagt. Thank you very much. And basically, it talks about how the findings of the James Webb Telescope, which is this incredibly powerful apparatus, which is basically the successor to the Hubble telescope, that's captured these so-called deep field images from very, very, very far into the distant universe, being able to see much further than Hubble, and therefore also further back in time, because obviously light only travels so fast. It's basically undermining everything that was the assumed wisdom of the entire field of cosmology, based on the model of the Big Bang, which was the supposed, in the minds of of classical physics for a very long time, the beginning of the universe about 3.8 billion years ago. Basically, this telescope has found galaxies much, much further away, and therefore much further back in time than they should be, and much more mature than they should be. I've got a quote, actually, from the video. It says, "By our best estimates, the first large galaxies should have emerged 500 million years after the Big Bang or so, not much before. But it isn't only that we found large galaxies existing way before that, the new galaxies also seem to be too mature. Some scientists argue these aren't real cracks in the theory, but mirages that will disappear with time, or raw gems that will end up refining our theories. Others are more radical and say we need completely new ideas. But whatever the case, the big picture is difficult to ignore. The sense of crisis is growing." And the reason I highlight this is because the founding theoretician of our predecessor organization, Ted Grant, together with Alan Woods, our current leader and main theoretician, produced a book about the crisis in science in 1995, which argued that the idea of a discrete beginning of the universe made no sense, because matter is eternal, it can't be destroyed, it can't be gotten rid of, it can only transform from one state to another. And Ted, I will quote directly, in about 1990, said that if scientists were to produce a telescope more powerful than Hubble, they will not see the Big Bang. All they will see is galaxies and still more galaxies stretching into infinity. So
I think he was talking before the Hubble.
This was when Hubble was about to be launched. This was
Yes.
1990.
So he was predicting that when they launched the Hubble, they would find things that would contradict the Big Bang, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Which they did. And then their response to that was to create an even more powerful telescope to look, so they can look, because they're looking for the beginning of time, right?
That's right, yeah.
Because that's what the theory would say, that at some point you'll find these really, really young galaxies.
Yeah.
They've just been born, because you're looking at the Big Bang, right? Because you're looking so far back in time. And then they keep having to make more powerful telescopes that can look further and further back in time, so to speak, because the light travels. And so they're expecting to find these young galaxies, and they keep not finding them.
Yes.
I mean, inevitably they find some, but they don't find... they find these old ones as well.
Yes.
As long as the young ones, they find the old ones, which completely contradicts the whole idea about the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe.
Yes. And a dialectical materialist method of the universe is perfectly capable of reconciling the idea of matter being eternal and constantly in a process of change and development. And the point that Ted was making in this book, Reason and Revolt, which I recommend, and I'll put in the description a link to where you can buy it.
If you want to master dialectic, it's not a bad place to start.
Not a terrible place to start at all. The point that's made in that book is that you only arrive at the idea of a discrete beginning of time if you begin on a false philosophical premise. And really, it's a creation myth snuck in by the back door. It's in total contradiction to everything else we understand about the universe. And if you enter with a dialectical philosophical outlook, a dialectical materialist philosophical outlook, you won't have all the data, and there's still work to be done. There's still research to be done obtaining the particulars. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying, as Nicholas was saying earlier, it's not as though dialectics is a magic key which unlocks the universe the second that you feel you've understood the method. You still have to do the work to actually discover the evidence.
It doesn't actually solve the question. It doesn't actually explain, we say, all astronomical phenomena. Dialectics on its own does not do that. It just helps you.
It puts you on the right road. That's the point. The correct philosophical framework sets you on the right road, and the incorrect philosophical framework could set you on the wrong road. Another egregious example, I would say, is eugenics and race theory from the turn of the 20th century, which was a kind of an application, a bastardized application of some of Charles Darwin's idea about evolution applied to human social organization and race relations of the day, reflecting the racist and reactionary ideas of the ruling class at that time, and basically used to justify the idea that some races are inferior and superior, the idea that you can breed bad traits out of human beings. This was a philosophical problem which produced very reactionary results. So it's not as though this is just an intellectual question. If you go into any problem with the wrong outlook, you will end up with the wrong outcomes.
Yeah, and one of the things that science has battled with throughout its existence is the question of materialism versus idealism.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole point, the fact that they're basing themselves on the idea that we are not... Basically, a lot of scientists, even if they claim probably to be in one way or another, claim to be materialist or base themselves on the study of the real world. In reality, a lot of the time they can't separate their own perception of things, their own measurements of things, from what the actual real world is. And this causes them problems time and time again.
Mm-hmm.
Or understanding the relationship between your measurement of things and the thing itself, that is a dialectical relationship, which we don't have time to go into, but that is... Without that understanding of how these things relate to each other, it doesn't mean that you can't be a scientist, but it does hamper you in your work.
Mm-hmm. Well, we spent quite a long time on dialectic, but
Yes.
That's not an accident because it's the binding principle, along with materialism, of our entire tradition. So I've put lots of recommendations for reading in the description. So if you want to master the dialectic yourself, that's the place to start. Okay, I'm going to move on. We had a few questions along similar lines. Basically, how did Stalin come to power in the Soviet Union?
Yeah, and I think this is another example where really understanding dialectics is without dialectics you can't arrive at a satisfactory answer. I remember history classes in school where they're trying to talk about how Stalin was the more ruthless and therefore he was more successful than Trotsky. Even though Trotsky should have been the natural successor to Lenin, because Stalin was more ruthless, more cunning, then therefore he was able to emerge victorious. Trotsky had control of the Red Army, the loyalty of the Red Army, then surely he should have succeeded rather than Stalin. But this is not understanding the real forces that were at play. It doesn't even attempt to understand the real forces that are at play at the Soviet Union and what the situation was like. And we were talking about how the Soviet Union was Russia was a backward country at the time. And really, this also had a reflection in the new regime. Just because they had the revolution didn't mean that it solved all the problems of Russia, that all the cultural backwardness in terms of illiteracy and all kinds of things, that the economic backwardness, most of the peasantry would have, none of the peasantry would have had tractors, but maybe not existing in Europe either. But they were very primitive conditions in agriculture, very limited application of machinery to agriculture. And it meant that the whole of the countryside was very unproductive, backward in terms of technology. And this put an enormous amount of pressure on the young Soviet state. Now, obviously, then you have the effects of the First World War, the effects of the Civil War, and so you land after the Civil War when they won, with a very, very backward or very, very weakened economy. It was both weak to start with, but it had become even weaker due to these two wars. So you had the revolutionary will of the masses that had fought for and won this revolution. But the reality, the material conditions on the ground were not such that would promote, that were the conducive, or they weren't good for the building of socialism. And on top of that, as we mentioned, the Russia or the Soviet Union wound up being isolated. There was this revolution that was expected in the West. Russia were to be the beginning of the European Revolution, but it didn't come for various reasons. And so they wouldn't get the help by being integrated into a more advanced economy that would help them develop the economy, improve productivity of labor, shorten the working day, relieve the material deprivations in the country. That didn't happen, so they were stuck. And in this situation, and this is both Lenin and Trotsky analyzes this and pays some attention to, like Lenin towards the end of his life, early 1920s, and Trotsky at the same time. And obviously Trotsky survived, so he continues and develops the analysis. They talk about, inequality had to be the state that was created, rather being a state that was promoting equality. It had to promote inequality because it was necessary because of the backward conditions. They had to defend material differences, because otherwise you couldn't have the intellectuals, even the state administrators, living in the kind of conditions that a peasant were living in at the time, or even that of the industrial worker. It would have been impossible. They could not have been able to fulfill their functions. So here you have a state that basically defends inequality. And this was a necessary, a concession to the realities of the time. But it also created then a layer of society which had different conditions of living, and who gradually developed an interest in defending this inequality for its own sake, because it was defending privileges against the majority of the population. So it became from economic necessity into basically something that gradually emerged as a caste within society that was defending backwardness and these backward norms of distribution, defending the inequality, which became absolutely obscene some decades into the Soviet Union, where inequality levels were higher in the Soviet Union than they were in many capitalist states. Because of this.
Yeah, I mean, there's horror stories of Brezhnev with his fleets of fancy cars and the luxurious villas and dachas that the leading Soviet bureaucrats were enjoying, while the ordinary workers of the Soviet Union didn't live in anything like that kind of luxury. But although we should say, and it's always important to stress this, our criticisms of the USSR are not akin to those of the liberals and bourgeois. There were a huge leaps forward in so many areas on the basis of economic planning in the USSR, in terms of literacy, in terms of housing, in terms of industrial developments. I mean, Trotsky himself said that the accomplishments of the USSR in terms of going from a backward peasant economy to, even by the time he died, like an advanced or an increasingly advanced industrial power, and then after his death into a superpower, it justified the final victory of socialism not just on the pages of Das Kapital or in the language of dialectics, but in the language of steel, cement, and electricity. So we're not by any means downplaying the things that were accomplished in the Soviet Union on the basis of economic planning. However, as you say, you had a bureaucratic counter-revolution that, while basing itself on the planned economy, had to expropriate political power from the working class.
Yeah, and so this is like what Trotsky was really fighting was not Stalin himself, right? It was not an individual he was fighting, or a group of individuals. Well, there was this group, did it exist? And so what Lenin towards the end of his life, and then Trotsky after Lenin died, was fighting was not an individual. He was fighting these conditions, the backward conditions of Russia. And actually he was, if you look at what he comes, like one of the main things that he does, and what they call the left opposition, they develop a program for how to develop the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And this was one of the things that they really were fighting. Look, we need to develop the economy. This is how to take the thing forward. He was not producing manifestos on how Stalin was anti-democratic and so on. Obviously, that was true, but his main thing, the way to resolve these problems was by developing the economy, which would remove and as well as developing the revolution internationally. And these were the two prongs of Trotsky's, we say, prescription for how to fight the bureaucracy. And even in an honest way, both him and Lenin, they were actually, their beef was with the budding bureaucracy. Their opposition was to the budding bureaucracy, not to individuals and so on. And the whole making it into an individual question between two personalities, that was very much the method of the other side, who were fighting and trying to personalize it, turning into a personal question, but it was not at all. It was, in fact, it's just that Stalin became a useful tool for this growing bureaucracy, which was full of old Tsarist officials, old Mensheviks, and so on, who became his base of support. But it was these backward conditions which created conditions for bureaucracy, in which bureaucracy which used Stalin. Probably in a way he wasn't aware of how he was being used at the time. But they used Stalin. He became like a champion for the bureaucracy, and that's the person in the Bolshevik leadership who was more susceptible to the pressure that they were exerting on the party.
Mm-hmm. I remember after the defeat of the Chinese Revolution in 1927, where Trotsky had been warning, again, following the same conclusions that we talked about earlier, about the need for the working class to maintain independence from bourgeois elements, warning that there could be no alliances with the so-called progressive national bourgeois, the likes of Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, following advice from Stalin and the Stalinist faction, the Stalinist bureaucracy. The Chinese communists did ally themselves with Chiang Kai-shek and the bourgeois nationalists, and they were all slaughtered. And the oppositionists around Trotsky said, well, obviously this is a terrible tragedy, but does that not at least vindicate our position? And does that not play to our favour in terms of this struggle against the bureaucracy? Because it proves we were correct. And Trotsky says, no, this is actually a terrible blow to what we're trying to achieve. It's a terrible blow to the genuine revolutionaries and Bolsheviks, because it's weakened the objective basis for the world revolution, which is the only thing that could reverse our fortunes. And Trotsky said himself, in the absence of the revival of the world revolution, which obviously would create, a potential ally to the workers of Russia, but would also give confidence to the workers of Russia, who were exhausted after years of war. I mean, this is after the World War I, followed immediately by the Civil War. This would restore the confidence of the working class in Russia, which was directly in contradiction to the interests of the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy instinctively knew that it was parasitic. It instinctively knew that it didn't really play any independent role, which is part of the reason it became so repressive. It had to justify its position in the end and enforce its position through using the weapon of the state. Trotsky recognized that in the absence of the revival of the international revolution, there was no real way of reversing the fortunes of the Russian working class and of the left opposition, and indeed that was the case. I mean, he said himself, even if I had used the Red Army, to try and assert myself against Stalin and the bureaucracy, I still would have been at the head of an isolated worker state in terribly backward conditions, with the world revolution on the back foot.
I think he even said that it would have been worse to have a military dictatorship rather than a civilian one, which is the one that they got.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. So that is the reason, really, that in a nutshell, Trotsky was defeated, because the objective conditions favoured the bureaucratic counter-revolution. It didn't favour the progressive elements that remained in Russia.
Yeah.
There's a natural segue into our final question, which, put simply, is what was the situation like in post-Soviet countries after the collapse of Stalinism and the restoration of capitalism?
And I think that there, I think this, what you've raised about the advantage of the planned economy, this is what I meant. That I think that the planned economy, particularly in the 1930s, but also afterwards, it really proved itself to be far superior to the capitalist economy. Like, so if you compare, the Soviet Union was growing by leaps and bounds in the 1930s, even in spite of a lot of mistakes that were made, a lot of distortions and so on because of the way that the bureaucracy handled the economy. But nonetheless, it was growing far faster than any capitalist country, which, as you probably are aware, in the 1930s were in the middle of a deep crisis. So it really proved itself, and it's meant that, you know, a lot of people were looking towards the Soviet Union for a whole historical period. But the problems in the economy basically meant that this growth couldn't be maintained. The bureaucracy became more and more of a fetter on the development. Its interest ran more and more contrary to the development of the economy. It became more and more bureaucratic. More and more the local bureaucrats were just looking after themselves and not looking after the general interest of the economy, and therefore started to introduce all kinds of distortions. There's so many different examples of that. One is like how you can only get right foot shoes for a whole period because that was more efficient in a certain bureaucratic way. If you just produce right shoes 1 month and then left shoes the next month, right? They were more, but obviously completely useless from the point of view of someone who's trying to use shoes. Someone needs a new pair of shoes. You have to wait the whole month for the other shoes.
Oh, you wanted two?
Yeah. And these kind of distortions. Number one is like they have stories like they produced. They were asked by the plant to produce 1 ton of nails. So they produced a 1 ton nail, a nail that weighed a ton, which technically fulfilled the quota, but actually was completely useless. And there were so many examples.
What's sometimes called malicious compliance.
It's like so many examples of how they were on paper they were fulfilling the orders that were done of the plan, but in reality the goods were of poor quality and had to be discarded or were useless. And because the local bureaucrats, they were just interested in ticking a box, not in what really developed the economy. This became worse and worse and worse. There's also the attempt to keep the economy within the national boundaries, which, like every single country in Eastern Europe, had to have its own car manufacturing rather than sharing out and developing together the car industry together across Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, or China as well, for that matter. They tried to keep it on. And all this came to a head basically in the 1980s. Where the economy, towards the end of the 70s, early 80s, where the economy stalled. And this was the beginning of the end. And they could no longer bring out any kind of growth in the economy. And so they were just, the economy was stagnating and even started to decline in these conditions. And this then created the material conditions, along with defeat. And I think this is important to remember, the defeat of the radical wave in Europe, with the miners' strike in Britain, defeat of the movement in Italy, the
air traffic controllers in the US.
One after another. I mean, lots of different examples, different countries. But these defeats of the working class in the West also prepared the way for counter-revolution in the East. And the restoration of capitalism was, they promised all kinds of things, right, to the workers. Oh yeah, you're going to have like Western living standards, Scandinavian style socialism, where you can have both a welfare state and capitalism, this kind of thing. Promises were made. And obviously workers seeing how things weren't working, they were looking for a way out, looking for some kind of change. And they thought that, and Gorbachev in particular sold this idea of like a kind of social democracy or democratic socialism or something like that, right? Maybe you can have some capitalist elements together with the socialist elements or something like that could help develop the economy. But this was not at all what transpired, and in fact it was a complete and utter disaster. what took place. And this was across Eastern Europe, but in particularly in Russia and Ukraine. I got some figures of how in 1989 the total production of the economy, and this was after a decade of stagnation, should be added, it was worth $1.46 trillion, with 1,460 billion. But at the end of 1998, so after 9 years of capitalist reforms, there was merely 800 billion. So a fall of 44%. So this is tremendous. It's an absolute economic disaster, basically.
It's like a war. It's like the impact of a war.
That's right. It's like the Second World War, like Germany after the Second World War. That's the level of destruction that was taking place. So it's and Ukraine, you have a similar situation. And Ukraine is actually, when you look at and think about the war and so on, Ukraine is the country which has been worst affected in Eastern Europe as a result of the restoration of capitalism. The economy in Ukraine was worth something, or the GDP per capita was something like 85,000 hryvnia in 1989, and then fell to 34,000 by 1998. And this was the low point, which is a complete calamity.
Yeah. Like less than half.
There's less than half. So tremendous poverty and so on that came along with that. And then it did recover a bit, but only back to 64,000. So you're still down. You're talking about 20 years later after the beginning of the restoration of capitalism, and you're down by 25%. So this was the net, and then it stopped. So in 2007, it reached its peak, the economy, and it then started to decline. It went a little bit up and down, but it then, before the outbreak of the war, obviously the war has caused even more difficulties. But before the outbreak of war, it was 62,000. So it just gives you an idea of what tremendous calamity this was for Eastern Europe. And the restoration of capitalism, not at all did it give any positives for the working class, but was just an unmitigated disaster, particularly in Russia and Ukraine. In some countries fared a bit better, but most of the countries of Eastern Europe, for sure, they had there would have been working class people materially would have been far better off under the old system.
And let's not forget, in Yugoslavia, the breakup of Yugoslavia saw a genocidal war ensue when the national divisions reasserted themselves with a bang, and you saw some of the most horrific and horrendous bloodshed in Europe since the Second World War.
And sometimes they talk a bit, patronizingly about how there's these people, old people in the Eastern Europe, they have this nostalgia, right? Or it's even called ostalgi, East. Nostalgia for the old days, but then you look at materially how they lived then, what their life was like materially before the reintroduction of capitalism, and you look at what it was like after. It's not hard to see why they have this, why they're looking back and thinking, well, actually we had it better in those days.
Yes.
Obviously, there was no way forward for those economies on the basis of the bureaucracy that was ruining the economy. Only thing that could have solved the question was workers' control and the spreading of the internationalism, right? The spreading of the revolution, spreading of the abolishing of capitalism in the West. That would have saved the situation. But capitalism was not a solution at all. It was a complete disaster.
Yeah, and in terms of the human impact, I don't have the stats to hand, but the suicide rate went through the roof, alcoholism went through the roof, prostitution went through the roof. If you look at the social conditions in former Soviet countries in the 90s, it's absolutely devastating. The life expectancy on average in Russia, I think, fell by about 10 years in that period. Absolutely appalling. And not only was it terrible in terms of the living conditions, it was also a massive humiliation. I mean, this had been a superpower, and it was laid low in the space of only a few years. And also, a thing that I find striking is you get bourgeois commentators and liberals today who celebrate, the fall of the USSR and the Berlin Wall and this sort of thing as this great victory for liberal democracy. Francis Fukuyama saying, this is the end of history. Liberal democracy is the only form of society you could possibly imagine. It's conquered every other so-called alternative, and this is great for the world. But they complain about Putin, and they scaremonger about the people who run Russia today. Who were those people? They were the class of they were the caste of bureaucrats who went on to become the oligarchic capitalist class that expropriated the planned economy, tore it up, sold it off, and massively enriched themselves. Putin was a KGB officer. So on the one hand, you have these liberals celebrating this great step forward for democracy because of the collapse of the USSR, but then they'll say, oh, Putin's so awful and Russia today is so dreadful. It's like, well, that's a product of the collapse of the USSR.
I mean, Putin was, he was the candidate of the West and imperialism.
Tony Blair used to rub shoulders with Putin. He was the golden boy.
But it made sense because at the time, like Yeltsin, he sits in, throughout the 90s, he was the president of Russia, and he was a complete, all of these disasters. He was corrupt. He was not a democrat at all. He did not just one coup, but several. But he was completely tied to Western imperialism, Western finance capital, and so on. And the Russian workers, they completely had enough. They were so sick of him, and that's why he was moved to the side. And they instead they looked towards the Communist Party. There was a big wave of strikes. There was the elections in which the Communist Party had a chance of winning the presidential elections. It would have been a really it would have been quite a historic event, particularly if the Communist Party had done what they promised to do. But because of the weakness of the Communist Party, Putin managed to sneak through, and he actually was the one who basically was the candidate of imperialism to fight against the rising tide of communism in Russia at that time, right? Of people, of workers going back towards communism and so on. And Putin was the man. It was the man of the imperialists, and this is why you see him rubbing shoulders with all the major, like Tony Blair and all the other leaders. He was their man to sort out Russia and sort out the Russian problems. Later on, they realized that he had a mind of his own, and the Russian oligarchs, they had decided that they needed to defend their interests in a better way. But this was for sure. He was their candidate against the working class very much. And all the methods and stuff they complain about today, he used them all in the beginning. Yeltsin used them as well. It is not, when they call him, when they suddenly discover how they favor democracy in Russia and all these things, but it had nothing to do with formal rights, democratic rights of workers. It's everything to do with the right of the imperialists to loot and plunder the country.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground. We've dealt with labour theory of value, we've dealt with dialectics, we've talked about the rise of Stalinism and the fall of Stalinism. Is there any way that we can tie all these threads together to end this episode, Nicholas?
Well, I think really the question of dialectics and understanding and studying theory is what this podcast is about. But I think this is very important. Trying to understand the world and study the world that we have around us using the dialectical method. This is what makes it possible for us to intervene and take the right positions on questions like Putin's regime, to try to understand it not as in abstract, as anti-democratic, or is it dictatorship, not dictatorship, all these questions, but actually what is the real content, where does it come from, and where is it going as a result as well? What are the conditions that brought it into being, and which are therefore the conditions that will prepare its demise as well.
Yeah, I mean, dialectical materialism, as we've said, it's not a crystal ball, it's not a magic skeleton key, but it's a pretty good tool. It's the best tool that we've ever developed as a species for understanding anything you could name, from politics to science to the course of history. And if this podcast has provided anything in this episode and in all previous episodes and all subsequent episodes, hopefully it's set you on the course of trying to develop your understanding of the ideas, starting with the recommendations that I'll post in the description. And if you've missed any of the episodes up to this point, where we cover a range of different topics from history and different aspects of theory, then I invite you to go back and check those out, because we deal with some of the things that Nicholas has been talking about in more detail. I'm also going to link some episodes we've done with Nicholas before. We had an episode on socialism in one country, for example, which goes into a bit more detail about why that's an anti-Marxist theory or idea. And I'll also post episodes about the permanent revolution and the nature of Stalinism, which I think you'll find useful. But if there's nothing else and no more questions on the board, then Nicholas, I'll say thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And I'll say thank you all very much for watching. I'll see you next week for a new episode of the Spectre of Communism podcast.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communist. Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.